The air in the subterranean parking garage of Ethelred Technologies was a sterile, refrigerated thing, smelling of cold concrete, curing rubber, and the faint, arrogant ghost of premium gasoline. It was a cathedral of wealth, silent save for the low, electric hum of the fluorescent lights that cast long, distorted shadows from the concrete pillars, making the rows of gleaming luxury vehicles look like slumbering metallic beasts. In this mausoleum of power, Anya Sharma moved with a quiet efficiency that rendered her all but invisible. Dressed in the drab gray and blue uniform of a third-party cleaning service, she was just another part of the building's machinery, a ghost who appeared after hours to erase the day's smudges and spills. Her movements were fluid and economical as she guided the industrial mop across a small, dark stain on the polished floor. To any casual observer, she was simply a woman doing her job, her expression placid, her focus on the task at hand. But beneath that surface of anonymous labor, a universe of discipline and memory churned. Her focus was not on the ammonia-scented water, but on the precise angles of the garage, the locations of the 3 emergency exits, the resonance of sound, and the blind spots created by the massive support columns. Her mind was a fortress, built brick by brick over years of relentless training, and sealed with the mortar of a grief so profound it had become her source of power. As she worked, the scent of the cleaning fluid would sometimes be replaced by a phantom smell, the acrid odor of smoke and dust that lingered in her memory from a news report years ago. It was the smell of a world torn apart, of a life extinguished. The image of her father, a career diplomat with a kind smile and an unshakable belief in dialogue, would surface, not as he was in life, but as he was in the aftermath. A name on a casualty list, a folded flag, a victim of a bombing that a proper security detail could have, and should have, prevented. That failure had become the central axis of her existence. She had abandoned a future in international law, a path her father had dreamed for her, and had instead forged herself into the very thing he had lacked in his final moments, a perfect, silent shield. This janitor's uniform was not a mark of her station in life. It was camouflage, the ultimate expression of her creed. To be underestimated, to be overlooked, was to hold the ultimate tactical advantage. No one dies on her watch. It was a promise whispered into the void her father had left behind, a vow that had become the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The silence of the garage was suddenly shattered by a sound that was utterly alien to its controlled environment. The sharp, percussive slap of expensive leather shoes hitting concrete at a furious pace. The sound echoed, amplified by the cavernous space, announcing an arrival long before the figure came into view. Julian Thorne erupted from the elevator vestibule like a storm front, a whirlwind of bespoke tailoring and pure, undiluted rage. He was a man sculpted from privilege and impatience, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He held a phone to his ear, his voice a low, vicious snarl that cut through the air. He wasn't speaking to the person on the other end. He was eviscerating them, using words like weapons, dissecting their incompetence with the cold precision of a surgeon. He moved without looking, his entire world compressed into the small screen in his hand and the fury in his veins. He was the king of this concrete kingdom, and the world was expected to part before him. To Anya, he registered first as a disruption, a sudden variable in a controlled equation. Her training kicked in automatically, her eyes tracking his trajectory, noting his agitated state, the aggressive angle of his shoulders, the careless swinging motion of the hand that wasn't holding the phone. He was a creature of pure ego, blind to his surroundings. Anya remained perfectly still, her mop held in her hands, positioned beside the small, yellow, wet floor sign she had placed just moments before. She had followed protocol perfectly. She was a fixed point, a non-entity. But in Julian Thorne's world, anything that did not actively facilitate his forward momentum was an obstacle to be bulldozed. He was in the middle of a tirade, spitting venom about a 9-figure deal that had soured, his focus so absolute that he failed to see the small plastic sign or the woman standing beside it. His polished Italian loafer came down directly on the freshly mopped patch of floor. For a fleeting, almost comical moment, his entire body, a vessel of immense corporate power, lost its purchase. He flailed, his arms pinwheeling as he fought for balance, his furious monologue devolving into a startled grunt. He managed to stay upright, but the damage was done. A smudge of gray, dirty water now marred the pristine leather of his $4,000 shoe. The phone call was abruptly ended with a final, clipped curse. And then, his head snapped up, his eyes scanning for a target, a receptacle for the fresh wave of humiliation and rage that now consumed him. His gaze landed on Anya. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the confrontation that will change everything, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served in the most unexpected ways, make sure you're subscribed and have hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment. The stage is set for a confrontation in the heart of this cold, concrete empire, and you are about to witness an incredible story of resilience and hidden power. We're about to see what happens when unchecked arrogance collides with unshakable discipline. For a moment, there was only the low hum of the lights. Thorne's chest rose and fell, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. He didn't see a person. He saw a uniform, a mop, a yellow sign. He saw the source of his inconvenience, the cause of his momentary loss of dignity. The fury from his failed business deal now had a physical, tangible focus. He took a step forward, his body radiating a heat that seemed to warp the cold air around him. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, guttural snarl, dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. He pointed a trembling finger at her, then at the floor. He spoke of her incompetence, her uselessness, her sheer, unforgivable stupidity for existing in his path at that exact moment. He called her a nothing, a smudge on the floor she was paid to clean, a waste of oxygen who had dared to impede his progress. Each word was a perfectly crafted dart, designed to belittle, to wound, to assert his dominance and her insignificance in the grand cosmic order of his universe. He was a god in this place, and she was less than an insect. Anya did not flinch. She did not cower or look away. Her training had conditioned her for this. For moments of extreme psychological pressure, she remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting on the handle of the mop. Her eyes, calm and deeply observant, met his. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, unnerving stillness, a placid defiance that seemed to reflect his own towering rage back at him. This lack of a reaction was, to Thorne, the ultimate insult. He expected fear. He demanded it. Her refusal to crumble before him, to grovel and apologize, was a challenge to his authority that his ego could not withstand. The last vestiges of his control shattered. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a single, explosive step. His hand, large and powerful, shot out and clamped around her throat. He slammed her backward, the impact of her body against the rough surface of a concrete pillar sending a dull thud echoing through the garage. The mop clattered to the floor, the sound shockingly loud in the sudden, violent silence. The pressure on her throat was immense, a crushing weight designed to intimidate and dominate. The cold, unforgiving concrete pressed into her spine. Julian Thorne leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul with rage. His eyes were wide, manic, searching for the terror he felt was his due. He squeezed harder, pinning her, immobilizing her. And then he hissed the words, the ultimate expression of his worldview, the question he believed affirmed his place at the top of the food chain and hers at the bottom. "Do you know who I am?" he snarled, the words a venomous spray. In that instant, as the pressure constricted her airway, Anya's mind became a place of absolute, crystalline clarity. The image of the bombed embassy flashed behind her eyes, the smoke, the chaos, the reports of a security failure. The man who had failed to protect her father was just like this one, arrogant, careless, blinded by a sense of his own importance. This assault was not just an attack on a janitor. It was a violation of the very order she had sworn her life to uphold. A cold fury, clean and sharp as a shard of ice, solidified in her veins. Her breathing did not quicken. It slowed, becoming deliberate and controlled. Her hands, which had been resting at her sides, became firm, her muscles coiling with a latent power he could not possibly comprehend. He had asked the question, believing it was his ultimate weapon. He had no idea it was her trigger. He had mistaken her stillness for weakness, her silence for fear. He had made the single, fatal error from which there was no recovery. He had underestimated the person he believed was beneath him. The entire parking garage seemed to hold its breath, the rows of silent, expensive cars bearing witness to the confrontation. His associate, who had just exited the elevator, stood frozen a dozen yards away, a statue of disbelief. Thorne, consumed by his own power, felt the satisfying fragility of the woman in his grasp and prepared to tighten his grip, to finally break her. But he never got the chance. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, he felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the body he held pinned against the pillar. It was a change so minute, so contrary to the laws of predator and prey, that his mind could not immediately process it. The woman in his grip was no longer a victim. She had become something else entirely. The shift was almost imperceptible, a change in the distribution of weight so subtle that it registered in Julian Thorne's raging mind not as a counteraction but as a flicker of physical impossibility. The body he had pinned against the cold, unyielding concrete, the body he expected to be a soft, trembling collection of fear and submission, suddenly felt different. It was as if the very molecules of her being had rearranged themselves, coalescing from something pliable into something dense and unmovable, like granite. Her frame, which he had perceived as fragile, now felt rooted to the very foundations of the building. His grip, which he believed was absolute, felt a sudden, strange resistance, not a struggle against his strength, but a fundamental negation of it. Inside Anya's mind, the roar of his voice and the crushing pressure on her throat had faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. The cold fury had washed away all extraneous thought, leaving behind only the pure, unblemished landscape of her training. She felt the exact angle of his wrist, the tension in his forearm, the slight imbalance in his stance caused by his lunge. She cataloged these details not as a person being attacked, but as a tactician assessing a series of critical, structural weaknesses in an opponent's posture. The world had slowed to a crawl, each microsecond a vast plain of opportunity. The promise she had made to her father's memory echoed in this new, silent space. No one dies on her watch. Not even this man. With emotion that was not born of muscle but of pure biomechanical principle, Anya initiated the first phase of the reversal. Her left hand, which had been hanging limply at her side, rose with a calm, deliberate speed. It did not strike or slap. It simply met the inside of his wrist, her thumb finding the precise location of the radial nerve with an intimacy that was almost surgical. She applied a small, sharp burst of pressure, a focused pinpoint of agony that sent a jolt of pure white-hot fire screaming up his arm. For Thorne, the sensation was utterly alien. It was not the blunt pain of a punch, but a sophisticated, debilitating shock that made his entire nervous system seize. His powerful hand, which had been clamped around her throat, spasmed involuntarily, the fingers losing their crushing strength. In that single, engineered moment of weakness, Anya rotated her body a mere 15 degrees, a pivot so small and efficient it was almost invisible. This tiny movement, combined with the pressure on his nerve, was all it took to completely shatter the integrity of his grip. His hand fell away from her throat, not because he chose to release her, but because his own body had betrayed him, responding to a stimulus it could not comprehend or resist. The air rushed back into her lungs, cold and clean. The laws of physics, which Thorne had always believed were subservient to his will and wealth, now turned on him with a vengeance. His forward momentum, the very force of his aggressive lunge, was no longer his own. Anya had captured it, and now she was redirecting it. As his grip failed, she flowed with his movement, becoming a fulcrum against which his own power was levered. Her right hand came up, not to push him away, but to gently guide his now flailing arm, her palm connecting with the back of his elbow. It was a touch, not a blow, yet it was devastatingly effective. She used his own uncontrolled trajectory to spin him, his large, expensive body suddenly feeling weightless and clumsy, a puppet whose strings had been expertly cut. He stumbled forward, a grunt of shocked disbelief escaping his lips as his feet, clad in their $4,000 shoes, tangled beneath him. The world, which had been a static tableau of his own making, was now a dizzying, incomprehensible blur of gray concrete and fluorescent lights. He was no longer the aggressor, he was a projectile, his path dictated entirely by the quiet, unassuming woman he had just tried to strangle. The associate, still frozen by the elevator, could only watch, his mind refusing to process the scene unfolding before him. The maneuver culminated in an act of absolute, inescapable control. As Thorne's body was turned, Anya stepped in, closing the distance he had created. Her movement was a seamless dance of leverage and pain compliance. She secured his arm, twisting it behind his back in a perfect hammerlock, while simultaneously sweeping her leg behind his, hooking his ankle. With his center of gravity completely compromised and his arm locked in a position that sent waves of agonizing fire into his shoulder socket, he had no choice. His body obeyed the command his mind was still struggling to understand. He crashed to his knees, the impact of his bespoke trousers on the grimy concrete floor, a sharp, humiliating crack that echoed through the silent garage. The pain was exquisite, a masterpiece of applied force that radiated from his shoulder, threatening to tear the joint from its socket with the slightest increase in pressure. He was completely immobilized, his face just inches from the very smudge of dirty water that had ignited his rage moments earlier. The world had been turned upside down. The janitor, the nothing, the smudge, was now standing over him, her hand holding his multi-million-dollar arm as if it were a disobedient child's. Julian Thorne's universe, a construct built on a foundation of fear, intimidation, and the absolute certainty of his own superiority, did not just crack, it atomized. The pain in his shoulder was a physical reality, but it was nothing compared to the psychic agony of his humiliation. He tried to speak, to curse, to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. Had he slipped? Had he imagined it? But the searing pain and the unyielding grip holding him in place were undeniable. He could feel her presence behind him, not as a source of heat or anger, but as a column of absolute calm. It was this stillness, this complete lack of emotional response, that was the most terrifying part. It was the detached efficiency of a machine, a force of nature that had rendered his wealth, his power, and his rage utterly, comically irrelevant. He was the CEO of Ethelred Technologies, a man who moved markets and shattered lives with a single phone call, and he was on his knees on the floor of his own parking garage, neutralized by a woman in a janitor's uniform. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it bordered on madness. The associate, a junior executive named Peterson, remained a statue of pure shock. His brain had short-circuited. He had witnessed Julian Thorne verbally flay prime ministers and reduce board members to tears. He had seen him as a force of nature, a titan of industry whose wrath was the stuff of corporate legend. To see him brought down not in a boardroom but on a concrete floor, and with such effortless, silent grace, was like watching a mountain crumble into dust. His mouth hung open, his briefcase slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering to the ground, the sound unnervingly loud. He saw the woman, Anya, adjust her grip slightly, a minute movement that caused Thorne to hiss in pain. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. She hadn't broken a sweat. She hadn't even raised her voice. The entire brutal exchange had been conducted in a terrifying silence. A ballet of violence that was more unsettling than any shouting match could ever be. Peterson's perception of the world had been irrevocably altered. The invisible people, the service staff, the background figures of his life suddenly seemed to hold a secret, hidden potential for danger and power that he had never imagined. Then, Anya spoke. Her voice was not the timid, deferential tone of a service worker. It was not the triumphant shout of a victor. It was a whisper, a calm, professional, and utterly chilling sound that cut through the humming silence of the garage and sliced directly into Julian Thorne's soul. She leaned down, her mouth close to his ear, her breath a cool, steady presence. The words were delivered with the flat, emotionless precision of a field report, each syllable a perfectly polished stone dropped into the chaotic pool of his mind. "My name is Special Agent Sharma," she said, the syllables clean and sharp. The title hung in the air, an impossible, ludicrous statement that his brain initially rejected. Special agent? This was a janitor, a cleaner, a nobody. But the undeniable reality of his position, the excruciating pain in his shoulder, and the absolute authority in her voice forced the truth upon him. He was not dealing with an employee, he was dealing with something far, far more significant. The revelation was a second, more powerful blow, a strike against his ego from which he would never fully recover. She continued, her voice never wavering from its calm, measured cadence. "And per Executive Order 305, my job is to know exactly who you are, Mr. Thorne." The use of his name, spoken with such professional detachment, was a final, devastating assertion of her power. She knew him. She had been assigned to him. This entire charade, her uniform, the mop, her presence here, was a lie. A deep, complex, and professional lie that he had stumbled into with all the grace of a charging bull. The scope of his miscalculation was staggering. He had not just assaulted a janitor, he had assaulted a federal agent. The legal and personal ramifications of his actions began to cascade through his mind. A torrent of fear that was cold and sharp, eclipsing even the physical pain. But Agent Sharma was not finished. She had one more piece of information to deliver, the one that would complete the total demolition of his reality and drag him from the realm of humiliation into the stark, terrifying landscape of mortal danger. Her whisper dropped even lower, becoming a tight, urgent hiss directly in his ear. The words were a freezing torrent of ice water poured directly onto his soul, extinguishing the last embers of his rage and replacing them with a primal, animalistic terror he hadn't felt since he was a small child. "Now get down," she commanded, the authority in her voice absolute and unquestionable. "There's a sniper on the overpass with a rifle aimed at your head." The statement was so direct, so devoid of drama, that it was instantly, horrifyingly believable. The world snapped into a new, terrifying focus. The humming fluorescent lights, the rows of luxury cars, the cold concrete floor, they were no longer symbols of his power. They were elements of a kill zone. The overpass, a feature of the city he drove past every day without a second thought, was now a perch for an unseen executioner. His life was in imminent danger, and the only thing between him and a high-caliber bullet was the very woman he had just tried to kill with his bare hands. The terror was a physical thing, a chemical reaction that flooded his system, turning his blood to ice. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The carefully constructed facade of Julian Thorne, the invincible titan, shattered into a million pieces, revealing the terrified man beneath. He no longer felt the pain in his shoulder. He only felt the crushing weight of his own mortality. He wanted to look up, to scan the overpass, but a renewed, sharp pressure on his arm from Agent Sharma kept his face pressed towards the floor. He was completely, utterly dependent on her. His survival rested entirely in the hands of the woman he had deemed a nothing, a smudge. The irony was so profound, so cosmically cruel, that it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. The entire power dynamic of his life had been inverted in the space of less than 30 seconds. He was no longer the king. He was the pawn, and his life was in forfeit. Suddenly, the silent garage was filled with a new sound. It was the whisper of high-performance engines, the squeal of tires on polished concrete. From the shadows at the far end of the garage, two black, unmarked sedans materialized, their headlights off, moving with a predatory speed and silence that was deeply unnatural. They slid into position, flanking the area around the pillar, their doors swinging open before they had even come to a complete stop. 4 figures emerged, 2 from each car. They were dressed in dark, functional, tactical gear, their movements economical and precise. They carried short-barreled rifles, holding them in a low-ready position, their eyes, hidden behind protective glasses, scanning every angle of the garage, every shadow, every potential threat. There was no shouting, no wasted motion. They communicated with subtle hand signals, a silent, deadly choreography that spoke of years of relentless training. They formed a perimeter, a human shield of disciplined lethality, transforming the public space into a hardened, secure zone. One of the agents, a tall man with a grim, set jaw, moved directly toward Sharma and the kneeling Thorn. He didn't spare a glance for the CEO. His entire focus was on his fellow agent. "Status, Sharma?" he asked, his voice a low, controlled rumble that was all business. "Principal is secure," Anya replied, her voice never losing its steady, professional tone. She still had Thorn locked down, the pressure on his arm unwavering. "Threat is viable. Sniper, elevated position, east overpass." The agent nodded, his eyes already scanning the direction she had indicated, even though they were deep underground. He keyed the radio on his shoulder. "Eagle 1 to Nest. We have a code red. Threat is active, east overpass. I want eyes on it now. We are moving the package to the safe house. Go." The response was a burst of static and a clipped acknowledgement. The machine was in motion. The agent then looked down at Thorn, his expression a mixture of professional concern and undisguised contempt. He had clearly heard the entire exchange over Anya's open mic. He addressed Thorn not as a powerful CEO, but as a piece of cargo that needed to be moved. "Mr. Thorn," he said, his voice flat and devoid of deference, "we need to get you out of here. Now, do exactly as we say." Thorn, still on his knees, could only nod, his mind reeling from the speed and efficiency of the response. These people had appeared out of nowhere, a secret army he never knew existed, and they were all focused on him. The reality of the assassination threat was now undeniable, reinforced by the presence of these heavily armed professionals. He was no longer in his world of hostile takeovers and stock options. He had been plunged into a shadow world of snipers, tactical teams, and safe houses. Anya finally released the pressure on his arm, but before he could even process the relief, 2 other agents were on him, hauling him to his feet with a strength that was both surprising and impersonal. They didn't treat him with care. They moved him with a practiced urgency, their hands gripping his arms firmly, guiding him, or rather, forcing him toward the open door of the nearest sedan. He stumbled, his legs feeling weak and unreliable. He caught a glimpse of Peterson, his associate, being quietly but firmly escorted toward the other vehicle by a 4th agent. Peterson's face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear that perfectly mirrored Thorn's own. They were both caught in a current far too powerful for them to resist, swept away from their normal lives and into something terrifying and new. The illusion of their control, of their importance, had been completely and utterly stripped away. He was bundled into the back of the armored SUV, pushed down onto the leather seat with a firmness that bordered on violence. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud, the sound of a vault being sealed. The world outside was instantly muffled, the sterile air of the garage replaced by the smell of conditioned leather, ozone, and the faint metallic scent of electronics. An agent slid in beside him, while another took the passenger seat. Anya herself got behind the wheel, her movements still as calm and economical as they had been when she was holding a mop. She started the engine, which purred to life with a low, powerful growl. The interior of the vehicle was dark, the windows heavily tinted, turning the brightly lit garage into a series of murky, indistinct shapes. Thorne felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over him. He was trapped, a prisoner in a rolling fortress, his fate entirely in the hands of the people he had never even known existed. The vehicle lurched forward, accelerating with a speed that pressed him back into his seat. The second sedan fell into formation behind them, and together they raced toward the exit ramp, their tires squealing in protest. As they ascended, the darkness of the garage gave way to the fading light of the late afternoon. For a brief moment, as they shot out onto the city street, Thorne could see the overpass in the distance, a mundane strip of concrete and steel against the bruised twilight sky. He scanned it frantically, his eyes searching for any sign of the sniper, a glint of metal, a human shape. He saw nothing but the slow, steady crawl of rush-hour traffic. But the threat felt real, a palpable presence that loomed over the entire city. He was being hunted, and the thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through his veins. He was no longer the hunter, the predator of the corporate world. He was the prey. Inside the cocoon of the armored vehicle, a tense silence reigned. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the hiss of the climate control, and the clipped, coded chatter from the radio mounted on the dashboard. Thorne sat rigidly, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He looked at the woman in the driver's seat. He could see her profile in the dim light, her expression focused, her eyes constantly moving, scanning the road, the mirrors, the surrounding buildings. She was no longer Anya the janitor. She was Special Agent Sharma, a guardian, a protector. The sheer competence she radiated was both a comfort and a profound source of shame. He had not just misjudged her, he had failed to see her at all. His arrogance had blinded him so completely that he had physically assaulted the one person whose sole purpose was to keep him alive. The thought was a bitter pill, a poison that spread through his soul. His mind, accustomed to calculating risk and reward in billion-dollar deals, was now frantically trying to process the new equation of his life: who wanted him dead? The list was long, a veritable encyclopedia of enemies he had made over a lifetime of ruthless business practices. He had ruined competitors, bankrupted founders, fired thousands of employees. He had always seen the consequences of his actions as abstract figures on a balance sheet, not as real-world motivations for murder. The idea that someone hated him enough to hire a professional killer was a concept his ego had never allowed him to seriously entertain. He had always believed he was untouchable, protected by his wealth and his army of lawyers. But a sniper's bullet has no respect for net worth. It is the great equalizer, and he was now staring it directly in the face, a truth he could no longer deny or ignore. He risked a glance at the agent sitting beside him. The man was a stoic sentinel, his rifle held across his lap, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. There was no conversation, no attempt to reassure him. This was not a customer service experience. This was a protective detail, a cold, professional operation designed to mitigate a threat. Thorne was the, quote, package, an asset to be secured, not a client to be coddled. This impersonal treatment was a fresh humiliation. He was used to being the center of every room, his every whim catered to. Here, in this vehicle, he was merely a liability, a problem to be managed. The sudden and total loss of status was as disorienting as the threat itself. He was stripped of his title, his wealth, his power. He was just a man, a target, and his life depended on strangers. The SUV weaved through traffic with an aggressive precision that parted cars like a ship's bow through water. Anya drove with an unnerving calm, her hands steady on the wheel. She was in her element. a master of this chaotic, dangerous environment. Thorn watched her, a storm of conflicting emotions churning within him. There was fear, of course, a deep and abiding terror. But there was also a grudging, nascent respect. He had built his empire on his ability to assess people, to find their weaknesses and exploit them. Yet he had looked at this woman and seen nothing. He had seen a uniform, a mop, a function. He had failed the most fundamental test of perception. His fatal flaw, the arrogance that had fueled his rise, was now revealed to be the very thing that could lead to his demise. He had been so blind, so utterly catastrophically wrong. As they drove, Anya's mind was a whirlwind of controlled calculation. She was processing the threat, running through protocols and analyzing the route. The sniper on the overpass was a classic opening move designed to flush the target out into a pre-planned secondary ambush. It was a professional hit, not the work of an amateur. This meant the enemy was sophisticated, well-funded, and patient. Her primary duty was to get Thorn to the safe house, a secure, hardened location where they could regroup and begin the real work of identifying the source of the threat. But her mind was also replaying the events in the garage, Thorn's explosive rage, his sense of absolute entitlement. He was not an innocent victim. Men like him created ripples, and those ripples often grew into tidal waves of desperation and revenge. She was protecting him, yes. That was her sworn duty. But a part of her, the part that remembered her father's belief in justice, was already beginning to suspect that she was shielding a man who was the villain of someone else's story. The radio crackled again, the voice of the agent from the follow car. Eagle 2, no tail. Traffic is normal for this time of day. Route to the nest is clear. Anya keyed her own mic without taking her eyes off the road. Copy Eagle 2. Maintain distance. We're 5 minutes out. The exchange was brief, efficient, and for Thorn, utterly alienating. He was a spectator in his own rescue, a passive observer of a language and a protocol he could not understand. He was used to being the one giving the orders, the one in control of the flow of information. Now he was completely in the dark, and the darkness was terrifying. He cleared his throat, the sound small and pathetic in the silent vehicle. He wanted to ask a question, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't form. What could he even ask? Who are you people? Why is this happening? He already knew the answer to the second question. It was happening because of him. The journey continued in silence for a few more minutes. The city lights flashing by in a hypnotic, disorienting blur. Thorn felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had been ripped out of his own life and dropped into the middle of a spy thriller. But this was not entertainment. The threat was real, the danger palpable. The men in the car with him were not actors. They were professionals whose job it was to deal with violence and death. And the woman driving, the woman he had assaulted, was their leader. The thought kept circling back, each time with a fresh sting of shame and disbelief. How could he have been so wrong? The question would haunt him, but for now, it was secondary to the more immediate question of his own survival. He was a man who had always believed he could buy his way out of any problem, but he was beginning to understand that some debts cannot be paid with money. They finally turned off the main thoroughfare, diving into a series of smaller, less-traveled side streets. The neighborhood grew more industrial, the gleaming skyscrapers of the financial district replaced by squat, anonymous brick warehouses and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. It was a part of the city Thorn had never seen. A place where the real, gritty work of the metropolis was done, far from the polished boardrooms and expensive restaurants he frequented. The SUV slowed, pulling into a narrow alleyway between two nondescript buildings. A heavy, corrugated steel door began to rise automatically, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. Anya drove the vehicle inside, and the door immediately began to descend behind them, sealing them in a concrete tomb, plunging them into near-total darkness before the interior lights flickered on, revealing a secure, underground garage. They had arrived at the nest, The agents moved with the same urgency as before, escorting a shell-shocked Thorne out of the vehicle and through a reinforced steel door. They entered a brightly lit corridor, the walls bare concrete, the floor polished gray epoxy. It was a sterile, functional space, devoid of any comfort or personality. It was a place built for one purpose: security. They led him into a large, open room. It was a command center, with a bank of monitors on one wall displaying security feeds, news channels, and complex data streams. A large conference table sat in the middle of the room, already littered with laptops and files. Several other people, analysts in plain clothes, looked up as they entered, their expressions serious and focused. This was the heart of the operation. This was where the hunt for his would-be killer would begin. Thorne was guided to a simple metal chair at the end of the table. He sat down, feeling small and insignificant in the face of the massive security apparatus that had sprung up around him. An agent placed a bottle of water on the table in front of him, the simple gesture feeling strangely profound. He looked around at the faces in the room. They were all professionals, all focused on the task at hand. And at the center of it all was Agent Sharma. She had shed her janitor's overcoat, revealing the dark, practical clothing of an operative beneath. She moved to the head of the table, her authority now unquestioned and absolute. She was no longer hiding in plain sight. She was in command, and the transformation was complete. She was about to begin the debriefing, to start dissecting his life, his business deals, his enemies, in order to find the one who had hired an assassin. He met her eyes across the table. For the first time he saw her. He saw the intelligence, the discipline, the iron will that had been hidden beneath the drab gray uniform. And in their depths, he saw not a hint of malice or triumph for the humiliation she had inflicted upon him. There was only a cold, professional focus. Her duty was to protect him, and his personal behavior was irrelevant to that duty. This detachment was, in its own way, the most profound condemnation of all. It told him that he did not matter as a person. His character, his rage, his power, none of it was a factor in her equation. He was a principle to be protected, a problem to be solved. And as she prepared to speak, to begin tearing apart the empire of secrets he had so carefully constructed, Julian Thorne understood that his ordeal was only just beginning. The threat to his life was immediate, but the threat to his soul, to the very foundation of who he believed himself to be, was just starting to unfold. Anya stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding the entire room. She picked up a tablet, her fingers swiping through encrypted files with a practiced ease. She did not look at Thorne, but addressed the room as a whole, her voice crisp and clear, laying out the initial parameters of the situation. "The threat is a Tier 1 professional," she began, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "The use of a sniper for the initial contact is designed to create panic and force a non-standard extraction. This suggests they have a secondary ambush planned along a predictable route. Our deviation from standard protocol has likely disrupted their plan, but they will adapt. We are now in a fluid threat environment." Her words were a foreign language to Thorne, a lexicon of violence and strategy that he had only ever encountered in movies. The reality of it was sobering, a cold weight settling in the pit of his stomach. She finally turned her gaze to him, and her eyes were like polished steel. There was no sympathy, only a demand for information. "Mr. Thorne," she stated, her voice a flat line, "we need to know who wants you dead. We are going to go through every significant business dealing, every hostile takeover, and every personal conflict you have been involved in for the past 5 years. We need names, dates, and details. The smallest grudge, the most insignificant rival, could be the key. Your life depends on your complete and total honesty. Do you understand?" The question was not a courtesy, it was a command. He was no longer the one asking the questions, the one demanding answers. He was the subject of an investigation, his life laid bare for these strangers to pick apart, searching for the rot that had led to this moment. All he could do was nod, a single pathetic gesture of acquiescence. The debriefing began. It was a grueling, relentless process. Anya led the questioning, her inquiries sharp, precise, and deeply insightful. She was not just asking about his enemies. She was dissecting the very methodology of his business. She knew the terminology, the strategies, the legal gray areas he had so expertly exploited for years. It became terrifyingly clear to Thorne that she was not just a bodyguard. She possessed a keen, analytical mind, one that was now turned like a scalpel upon the carefully constructed edifice of his life. She peeled back layers of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and non-disclosure agreements, revealing the brutal realities of his corporate raiding. With every answer he gave, he felt another piece of his power, his mystique, being stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable under the harsh fluorescent lights of the safe house. As the hours wore on, a pattern began to emerge from the chaos of Thorne's business dealings. A particularly vicious hostile takeover from 6 months prior stood out. It was a small, innovative tech firm called Phoenix Dynamics, founded by a brilliant but volatile engineer named Marcus Rourke. Thorne had not just acquired the company, he had systematically dismantled it, using a series of illegal short-selling tactics and corporate espionage to bankrupt Rourke personally, seizing his life's work for pennies on the dollar. He had destroyed the man completely, leaving him with nothing. As Thorne recounted the details, he did so with a detached, almost bored tone, describing the financial ruin of another human being as if he were discussing a mildly successful golf swing. He still didn't see the connection. He saw a business transaction, a victory. Anya, however, saw something else entirely. She saw the motive. Her eyes narrowed as she cross-referenced the name Marcus Rourke through a series of secure databases on her tablet. Her expression remained impassive, but inside, the pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with a chilling certainty. Desperation, humiliation, and a thirst for vengeance were a potent cocktail, a fuel powerful enough to drive a man to hire an assassin. The name Marcus Rourke hung in the air of the command center, a ghost summoned from the digital ether. It was more than a name. It was a nexus, a point where the abstract violence of corporate raiding intersected with the very real threat of a sniper's bullet. For Julian Thorne, it was the name of a defeated adversary, a footnote in a long and profitable chapter of his career. But for Anya Sharma, it was the beginning of a trail, the first loose thread in a tapestry of crime she was now tasked with unraveling. The initial phase of the investigation was a silent, intense ballet of digital forensics. The room was cold, smelling of conditioned air and the faint ozonic hum of powerful servers. Thorne sat in his metal chair, a king deposed, watching as analysts, their faces illuminated by the ghostly blue light of their monitors, dove headfirst into the labyrinth of his financial empire. He watched as they pulled up encrypted files and shell corporations he had long forgotten, each one a monument to his own ruthless genius. He had always seen this complexity as a shield, an impenetrable fortress of legal and financial misdirection. Now, under the calm, methodical gaze of Agent Sharma, he was beginning to see it for what it truly was, a crime scene. Anya directed the digital assault with the quiet authority of a seasoned field commander. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her instructions were precise. Her understanding of the digital architecture of Thorne's world preternaturally deep. She pointed to a series of offshore transactions, a web of transfers designed to look like legitimate investments, but which she recognized as a classic money laundering pattern used to pay for the illegal corporate espionage that had gutted Phoenix Dynamics. Thorne tried to object, to explain them away with a flurry of indignant corporate jargon, but his words were hollow, pathetic echoes of a power he no longer possessed. Anya simply held up a hand, silencing him without even looking at him, her entire focus on the cascading lines of code on the main screen. In her mind, she saw the ghost of her father, a man who believed in transparency and the rule of law. He would have been appalled by this deliberate, gleeful obfuscation of the truth, this celebration of deceit for profit. This was not just about protecting Thorne's life anymore. It was about exposing the rot that men like him introduced into the world. The digital trail, as expertly laid as it was, eventually ran into a wall of hardened steel. Thorne's most sensitive servers were air-gapped, isolated from any network, their data accessible only by a physical key and a multi-layered biometric scan. His personal lawyers, a firm known for its aggressive and borderline unethical defense of the ultra-wealthy, had constructed a digital fortress that was, for all intents and purposes, impregnable to a remote assault. The analysts shook their heads, their keyboards falling silent. They had hit a dead end. A palpable sense of frustration filled the room. For Thorne, it was a small, fleeting moment of victory, a reminder of his old power. He allowed a small, smug smile to touch his lips, believing his deepest secrets were safe, but he was once again making the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman at the head of the table. He saw a technical barrier. Anya saw a human problem, and human problems, she knew, always had human solutions. Her training was not just about technology and combat. It was about exploiting the weakest link in any security system: people. Anya stood up from the table, the movement drawing the attention of everyone in the room. She walked over to a secure communications terminal in the corner, her expression thoughtful and distant. She was running through a mental Rolodex of contacts, of favors owed, and information exchanged over a decade of silent service in the shadows. She needed an insider, someone who understood the specific legal architecture used by Thorne's law firm. The name that surfaced was that of an old mentor from her early days at the academy, a man named Elias Vance. He had been a legendary agent, a master of counterintelligence who had retired to a quiet, lucrative, but soul-crushingly dull job as a senior compliance consultant for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had once told her that the only thing more corrupt than a criminal was the lawyer who kept him out of jail. It was a long shot, a call that would put Elias in a professionally compromising position, but the lives of her team, and even Thorne himself, were on the line. She had to make the call. The faint scent of her father's favorite pipe tobacco, a phantom memory from her childhood, filled her senses for a moment, a reminder of the good men who fought against the darkness. The call was a masterpiece of coded language and professional understatement. Anya didn't mention Thorne by name, nor did she speak of assassins or safe houses. She spoke of a hypothetical case, a complex structure of legal firewalls surrounding a private equity firm. She used phrases and case precedents that only Elias would understand, painting a picture for him without ever drawing the outline. On the other end of the encrypted line, Elias Vance was silent for a long time, the only sound the faint hiss of the secure connection. He understood the risks. Helping her would mean bending, if not breaking, a dozen SEC regulations. It could cost him his career, his pension, his comfortable, quiet life. But he also heard the urgency in Anya's voice, the steely determination that he himself had helped forge in her years ago. He remembered the fierce, grieving young woman who had walked into the academy, determined to build a shield to protect the world, and he knew he could not refuse her. He was a man who had spent his life in the gray areas, and this was a shade of gray he was willing to navigate for her. Elias did not give her a password or a back door. He gave her something far more valuable: a name. The name was Arthur Finch, the former chief financial officer of Phoenix Dynamics. Finch was the man who had signed off on the fraudulent accounting that had allowed Thorne to trigger the hostile takeover. According to Elias's information, Finch had been given a golden parachute of $10 million and a non-disclosure agreement so ironclad it was practically a threat. He had then disappeared, retiring to a quiet, secluded life in a wealthy suburb of upstate New York. Finch was the weak link. He was the human element, the man who had sold his soul for a comfortable retirement. He was the keeper of the keys, the one person who could unlock the digital fortress and expose the full extent of Thorne's crimes. Finding him and convincing him to talk was now Anya's primary objective. The hunt had moved from the digital world to the physical one. It was no longer about code. It was about conscience. Leaving Thorne and his associate Peterson under the heavy guard of the tactical team, Anya prepared to move out. She changed out of her operational gear and into the unassuming civilian clothes of a graduate student: jeans, a simple sweater, and a pair of worn sneakers. She became invisible again, a ghost preparing to move through the world unseen. Her weapon was concealed, her movements fluid and unremarkable. As she prepared to leave, Thorn stopped her, his voice a low, desperate plea. "What are you doing?" "Where are you going?" he asked, the arrogance in his tone now completely replaced by a raw, naked fear. He had grown dependent on her presence, on the aura of calm competence that surrounded her. The thought of her leaving, of him being left behind in this concrete box, was terrifying. Anya paused at the door and looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm going to find the truth, Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of an oath. "It's the only thing that can keep you alive." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Thorn alone with the cascading consequences of his own actions. The drive upstate was a journey through a different world. The gritty, industrial landscape of the safe house gave way to the manicured lawns and sprawling McMansions of suburban affluence. This was where the spoils of corporate warfare were enjoyed, in quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sacs where the violence of the boardroom felt a million miles away. Anya found Arthur Finch's house easily. It was a large, ostentatious home, a monument to a guilty conscience, with too many gables and a 3-car garage filled with luxury vehicles he rarely drove. She didn't approach the front door. Instead, she spent hours observing, melting into the background of the quiet neighborhood. She watched Finch through a pair of binoculars from a parked car down the street. She saw a man trapped in a golden cage. He moved with a nervous, haunted energy, constantly looking over his shoulder, his hands trembling as he watered his prize-winning roses. He was a man drowning in the blood money he had accepted, and Anya knew that a part of him was desperate for a lifeline. She made her approach at dusk, as the sky turned a bruised purple and the lights inside the houses began to glow with a warm, inviting light. She didn't use the doorbell. She circled around to the back of the house, slipping through a gate left carelessly unlocked. She found Arthur Finch in his meticulously organized workshop in the garage, sanding a piece of antique furniture, the smell of sawdust and varnish thick in the air. He was so absorbed in his work, a desperate attempt to create something beautiful with hands that had signed away so much ugliness, that he didn't hear her enter. When she spoke his name, her voice a quiet, calm presence in the dusty air, he jumped as if he had been shot. He spun around, his face pale with terror, a piece of sandpaper clutched in his hand like a weapon. He saw a young woman, unassuming and non-threatening, but there was an intensity in her eyes, a seriousness that told him she was not there to sell cookies. The conversation that followed was not an interrogation. It was a delicate, surgical procedure on a man's soul. Anya didn't threaten him or raise her voice. She simply laid out the facts. She spoke of Marcus Rourke, of the lives that had been destroyed by the collapse of Phoenix Dynamics. She spoke of the assassin that had been hired, of the cycle of violence that had been set in motion by a single act of corporate greed. She didn't accuse Finch. She empathized with him. She spoke of the pressure he must have been under, of the impossible choice he was forced to make. She held up a mirror to him, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur Finch was forced to look at the man he had become. He saw not a successful retiree, but a coward, a collaborator in a crime that was now escalating into bloodshed. The carefully constructed walls of his denial began to crumble, brick by painful brick. Finch resisted at first, his voice trembling as he spoke of the non-disclosure agreement, of Thorne's army of lawyers, of the very real danger he would be in if he spoke out. He had a family, a life he had built here. He couldn't throw it all away. Anya listened patiently, letting him voice all his fears. When he was finished, she looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering, and she told him about her father. She spoke of him not as a diplomat, but as a man who believed that a single person, armed with the truth, could stand against an empire of lies. She told Finch that he had a choice. He could continue to live as a prisoner in his beautiful house, forever haunted by what he had done, or he could choose to be the man who stopped the cycle, the man who brought the truth into the light. She offered him not a threat, but a chance at redemption. It was a choice between fear and freedom, and it was his to make. Tears streamed down Arthur Finch's face, carving clean paths through the fine layer of sawdust on his cheeks. He wept for the man he had been, for the integrity he had sold so cheaply. He looked at Anya, at this quiet, powerful woman who had appeared in his garage like an avenging angel, and he saw a path out of the prison he had built for himself. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that was both a surrender and a declaration of war. He walked over to a heavy, steel safe hidden behind a stack of lumber. He spun the combination lock, his trembling fingers finding the familiar numbers. The safe swung open, revealing not cash or jewelry, but a single, encrypted hard drive. It was his insurance policy, the one piece of leverage he had kept. It contained everything: the original, unaltered accounting books of Phoenix Dynamics, recordings of his conversations with Thorne's lawyers, and the complete, unredacted details of the illegal stock manipulation scheme. It was the smoking gun. It was the key to destroying Julian Thorne's empire. Finch handed the drive to Anya, his hand shaking so violently she had to steady it with her own. The plastic of the drive felt cold in her palm, but it radiated a heat of pure, unadulterated truth. "He will come after me," Finch whispered, his voice hoarse with a mixture of terror and relief. "He will try to destroy me." Anya looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed a small, reassuring smile to touch her lips. "He will have to get through me first," she said. The words, a simple statement of fact, a promise sealed in the dusty air of the garage. "You and your family will be placed in protective custody. You did the right thing, Mr. Finch." She turned and left as quietly as she had arrived, leaving the former CFO standing in his workshop, a man who had just taken the first, terrifying step towards reclaiming his own soul. The air outside was cool and crisp, and the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. As Anya drove back towards the city, the hard drive resting on the passenger seat beside her, she felt a profound sense of clarity. The pieces were all in place. She now had the motive for the assassination attempt, the identity of the man who likely ordered it, and the irrefutable proof of a crime far greater than she had initially suspected. She was not just protecting a potential victim anymore. She was building a case against a predator. A message pinged on her secure device. It was from the tactical team back at the safe house. Thorne was becoming agitated. He had been making calls, trying to pull strings, attempting to contact his lawyers and political allies. He was trying to reassert his power, to shut down the very investigation that was keeping him alive. He was beginning to realize that the threat from the assassin's bullet was nothing compared to the threat Anya Sharma and the truth she now held in her hand posed to his entire existence. The tension was escalating on two fronts. The assassin, Marcus Rourke, was still out there, a ghost in the city, undoubtedly reevaluating his plan, preparing for a second, more direct attack. And Julian Thorne, the man they were trying to protect, was actively working against them, his arrogance and paranoia making him a liability. Anya knew the situation was rapidly approaching a breaking point. The confines of the safe house would not hold for much longer. They would have to move Thorne, and when they did, Rourke would be waiting. The ambush was not a possibility, it was a certainty. She had to anticipate his moves, to think like an assassin, to see the city not as a collection of streets and buildings, but as a tactical chessboard, a landscape of kill zones and escape routes. Her mind began to work, formulating a plan, a strategy that would not only protect Thorne's life, but would also ensure that the evidence on the hard drive would see the light of day. The final phase of her plan began to crystallize in her mind. It would be a high-stakes gamble, a piece of calculated misdirection, designed to draw the assassin into a trap of her own making. She would use Thorne's own predictable arrogance as bait, She would create a scenario where both the hunter and the hunted would be forced into a single, controlled environment, a place where she could neutralize the immediate threat and ensure the long-term victory of justice. The stage for the final confrontation needed to be set, not in a sterile safe house or a chaotic city street, but in a location that held a symbolic power, a place that would represent the final, total collapse of Julian Thorne's world. She knew exactly where it had to be. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and relied on her ability to control every variable in a situation that was spiraling towards chaos. As the city skyline reappeared on the horizon, a glittering constellation of man-made stars, Anya felt a cold, calm resolve settle over her. The memory of her father was strong now, not as a source of grief, but as a guiding principle. He had believed in fighting battles in the open, with words and laws. She was about to fight a battle in the shadows, with tactics and force, but the goal was the same, to ensure that the truth prevailed. The hard drive on the seat next to her was more powerful than any rifle. It was the weapon that would win the war, but first, she had to survive the coming battle. She keyed her communications device, her voice steady and clear as she began to issue a series of coded orders to her team, setting the pieces in motion for the final, dangerous act. The checkmate was in sight. She just had to navigate the minefield to get there. The hunt for evidence was over. The hunt for the hunter was about to begin. The return to the Ethelred Technologies headquarters was a masterpiece of calculated risk, a deliberate and chilling procession back into the heart of the beast's lair. Anya's plan was a symphony of psychological warfare, built upon the unshakable foundation of Julian Thorne's own monumental ego. She knew that the assassin Marcus Rourke would anticipate a flight to a more secure, unknown location. The last thing he would expect was a return to the scene of the initial threat. It was audacious, it was arrogant, and it was a move straight from Thorne's own playbook, making it the perfect bait. The armored convoy, now reduced to a single SUV to appear less conspicuous yet more vulnerable, moved through the city's glittering canyons of glass and steel with a placid, almost leisurely pace. Inside, the silence was a living thing, thick with unspoken terror and anticipation. Thorne sat rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather seat, his eyes darting to every shadow, every vehicle that drew alongside them. He was a man stripped of all agency, a passenger in a nightmare of his own creation, utterly dependent on the calm, focused woman in the driver's seat. For Anya, the world outside the reinforced windows was a shifting tactical map of threats and opportunities. Her breathing was slow and even, her heart a steady, metronomic drum against her ribs. The memory of her father's final, unprotected moments was a cold, clear flame in her mind, not a distraction, but a sharpening stone for her focus. This was her vow made manifest, a perfect, impenetrable shield, forged in grief and tempered by discipline. She was not just driving a vehicle, she was steering the course of justice, using one man's violent rage to trap another. The ambush came not with a roar, but with a sudden, brutal finality that seemed to rip a hole in the fabric of the night. As the SUV made the final turn into the service entrance leading to the subterranean garage, a heavy-duty sanitation truck, its lights off, suddenly roared to life from a darkened alleyway. It was a battering ram of rusted steel and raw horsepower, and it slammed into the rear quarter panel of the SUV with the force of a controlled demolition. The sound was a deafening cataclysm of tearing metal and shattering glass, the impact throwing Thorne violently against his restraints, a strangled cry of pure terror escaping his lips. The vehicle spun, its tires screaming in protest against the asphalt, before crashing to a halt against a concrete retaining wall. For a heartbeat, there was only the high-pitched whine of a dying engine, and the frantic, panicked blinking of the hazard lights, casting a hellish, rhythmic orange glow over the scene. Anya, however, had moved before the impact had even settled. Her training had transcended conscious thought. her body reacting to the physics of the collision with an instinct honed by 1,000 brutal simulations. Even as the SUV was spinning, her hand was already on Thorne's shoulder, her voice a sharp, commanding bark that cut through his fear. "Down! Stay down!" she yelled, shoving his head below the level of the window. Simultaneously, her other hand was on her sidearm, her eyes scanning the chaos outside, identifying the threat, calculating the angles, her mind a cold, clear engine of tactical response in the heart of the storm. The loading dock was a concrete chasm, a labyrinth of dumpsters and stacked pallets that offered both cover and 1,000 potential ambush points. Anya half-dragged, half-threw Thorne out of the crippled SUV, the air thick with the acrid smells of burnt rubber, spilled diesel, and the city's fetid garbage. The rhythmic pulse of the hazard lights was now joined by the distant, approaching wail of sirens she had prearranged, a ticking clock for both her and the assassin. A figure detached itself from the shadows, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. It was Marcus Rourke, clad in dark, functional clothing, a suppressed pistol held in a two-handed grip. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury, his eyes burning with the righteous fire of a man who had lost everything. He was not a common thug. He was a man on a mission, a ghost of Thorne's corporate violence made flesh. The first shot was a soft, almost polite cough from the suppressor, the bullet sparking off the concrete pillar just inches from Thorne's head. Anya didn't hesitate. She shoved Thorne behind a massive, overflowing dumpster and turned to face the threat, her own weapon now up and ready. The loading dock became a deadly chessboard. Rourke was skilled, using the environment to his advantage, moving from cover to cover with a disciplined efficiency. But Anya was not just a tactician. She was a student of human nature. She knew Rourke was driven by a singular, burning need for revenge, and that emotional core was his greatest weakness. She drew his fire, forcing him to move, to expose himself, her own shots not aimed to kill, but to control his movement, to herd him into the kill zone she had already chosen. The final confrontation was a brutal, close-quarters ballet of violence. Anya, using a moment of distraction as Rourke reloaded, closed the distance with an explosive burst of speed. The fight was not one of elegant martial arts, but of desperate, life-or-death struggle. It was the crack of bone, the grunt of exertion, the sickening thud of bodies hitting concrete. Rourke was strong, fueled by a righteous rage, but Anya was a master of a different kind of energy. She met his powerful strikes not with force, but with a calm, devastating application of biomechanics. She redirected his punches, used his own momentum to throw him off balance, her hand striking not at his face or chest, but at the delicate vital nerve clusters in his neck and wrists. It was a systematic dismantling of a human weapon, each movement precise, economical, and brutally effective. Thorne, cowering behind the dumpster, could only watch in horrified awe as the woman he had dismissed as a janitor fought with the focused ferocity of an apex predator, a silent, deadly force of nature that had been hidden in plain sight all along. He saw in her movements not anger, but a profound, almost terrifying level of control. She was not fighting to punish. She was fighting to neutralize, to restore order to the chaos he had created. In a final, desperate act of vengeance, the disarmed and heavily injured Marcus Rourke lunged not at Anya, but at the man who was the source of all his pain. He pulled a small, concealed knife from his boot, its blade glinting in the hellish orange light of the emergency flashers. He was a man with nothing left to lose, his eyes fixed on Julian Thorne, a final, suicidal charge to complete his mission. Thorne was frozen, a statue of pure terror, his mind unable to process the speed of the attack. He saw the blade coming, saw the murderous intent in Rourke's eyes, and in that instant, he knew he was dead. But then, in the space between one frantic heartbeat and the next, a shape moved, a blur of motion that interposed itself between him and the coming death. Anya stepped directly into the path of the lunge, her back to Thorne. She didn't have time to draw her weapon or counter the attack. She simply became a shield. Thorn heard a soft grunt, the sickening wet thud of the knife striking home, and saw Anya's body absorb the full force of the blow. For a split second, the entire world seemed to fall silent. In that moment, Julian Thorn's universe, the one built on the bedrock of self-interest and the belief that every person was a tool for his own advancement, was completely and utterly annihilated. He witnessed an act of pure, selfless sacrifice, a concept so alien to his nature that it broke something deep within his soul. He saw the woman he had brutalized, the woman he had deemed a nothing, willingly offer her life to save his. The tactical team swarmed the loading dock in the seconds that followed, their efficiency a stark contrast to the raw, emotional chaos of the preceding moments. Marcus Rourke was subdued, his fight finally extinguished, his quest for vengeance ending in the cold, impersonal click of handcuffs. Julian Thorn, however, could not take his eyes off Anya. She stood for a moment, her back still to him, before slowly turning. The knife was still in her hand, its blade clean. She had caught Rourke's wrist at the last possible nanosecond, the sickening thud he'd heard being the sound of her dislocating the man's shoulder with a brutal, twisting motion. She was unharmed. But the look in her eyes as she looked at Thorn was more devastating than any physical wound. There was no relief, no triumph. There was only a profound, weary disappointment. The sirens grew louder, but they were not alone. Following them were the black, unmarked sedans of federal agents, their doors opening to disgorge not tactical operators, but grim-faced men and women in the sharp, conservative suits of the Securities and Exchange Commission. At the head of the group was an older, distinguished man who held up a badge and a warrant. He walked past the bleeding, defeated Rourke, past the shell-shocked Thorn, and stopped in front of Anya. She simply held out the encrypted hard drive she had recovered from Arthur Finch. It was the true weapon, the one that would inflict the final, fatal blow. The man took it, nodded once, and then turned his attention to Thorn. His voice was cold, devoid of emotion, as he began to read the charges: securities fraud, corporate espionage, racketeering. Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Thorn's empire. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles now illuminated a scene not of an assassination attempt, but of a long overdue arrest. The hunter had become the hunted, and the shield had become the sword of justice. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when the full weight of Julian Thorn's crimes finally came crashing down on him. The downfall was absolute. A public spectacle of a titan brought low not by a rival in the boardroom, but by the quiet, unbreakable integrity of those he had deemed insignificant. His collapse was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing dissection under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The evidence on the hard drive was irrefutable, a digital chronicle of a career built on deceit and destruction. The trial was a media sensation, painting a portrait of a man so consumed by greed that he had come to believe the rules of human decency, let alone the law, did not apply to him. Stripped of his army of lawyers and his political influence, Julian Thorn was just a man, a pathetic, diminished figure whose fury had been replaced by a hollow, vacant despair. He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison, his name becoming a cautionary tale, a synonym for the corporate hubris that had led to his own spectacular demise. Ethelred Technologies, the empire built on a foundation of lies, was dismantled by court order, its assets seized and liquidated to create a restitution fund for the thousands of employees and investors whose lives Thorn had ruined in his relentless pursuit of wealth. Months later, the world had moved on, but for Anya Sharma, the mission was complete. Her world was one of quiet duty, far from the flashing cameras and sensational headlines. Her reward was not fame or recognition, but a quiet, profound sense of order restored. She stood now on the immaculate green lawn of the White House, the sun warm on her face. Her attire was no longer the invisible uniform of a janitor, but the crisp, professional suit of the Secret Service. A small, unobtrusive pin on her lapel, the only outward sign of her elite status. She had been promoted, given command of the most prestigious and demanding assignment in the service, the Presidential Protective Detail. Her gaze was calm, her posture relaxed but radiating a quiet, unshakable alertness as she scanned the crowd, her eyes missing nothing. The ghost of her father was with her now, not as a source of pain, but as a presence of profound peace. She had not just found justice for him, she had become the living embodiment of his ideals, a silent, watchful guardian standing between order and chaos, a shield for the nation. She had proven that the most effective weapon against the loud, brutal arrogance of power was the quiet, disciplined, and unwavering courage of a single individual committed to doing what is right. If Anya Sharma's incredible journey from an underestimated janitor to an elite presidential guardian inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that true strength often comes in the quietest packages. Her story is a powerful reminder that one's uniform does not define their worth, and that the greatest power lies in discipline, integrity, and the courage to stand for justice no matter the personal cost. For more unforgettable stories of righteous vindication and the triumph of the human spirit, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a moment of the justice you deserve to see.